So good morning. We're going to kick off the morning by talking about the global battle over information control. So we have an awful lot to cover in a short period of time. And so I want to start off at pointing out that we're at an inflection point right now where an authoritarian model of information control is spreading across the globe. And with it comes along the data theft, manipulation, censorship, propaganda, and so forth that I'll address. But all is not lost. There is a counter movement underway right now. And so I'll address that as well and talk about how those of us in this community and within democracies can help ensure that the democratic model can safeguard individual security and privacy. But before we get into that, let's go into what I mean by digital authoritarianism. So Freedom of the Net captures internet freedoms across the globe and has been doing so for several years. They note that we're at a point now where 8 years in a row of growing censorship across the globe. And if you look at these, those the colors are a little bit off, but the purple ones are the ones that are more censored, the less freedoms, and then the greens are the ones that have the most freedom. And this is the kind of activity where they talk about, closing off access to the internet, various kinds of censorship that can occur, and other kinds of government intervention into the internet. And so even recently, in January alone, we've seen 3 different elections within Africa have some sort of surveillance and some sort of internet shutdown and blackouts going on just over the last few weeks alone during election time to try and quell some unrest. And so it's something that we're seeing across the globe. And these are just a few of the quotes that we see from Freedom on the Net. And so when they're talking about digital authoritarianism, it really is the government's quest to control data through a variety of means. And I'll talk about that playbook in a minute. But one of the manifestations of all of this is that it's eroding trust in democracy across the globe as well. So it's not, what happens in these authoritarian regimes doesn't stay in their regimes. And that's a really important point to make as we look at this and we wonder, well, how does that impact us? Well, it's because it's spreading, and also a lot of their tools and tactics are then applied within democracies to hit at the core of the institutions of democracy. And so let's talk about what digital authoritarianism is and who some of the major advocates are and what some of the key tactics that are being used. So this is what I look at as an authoritarian playbook. For overarching, for heuristic, I include as bots, trolls, and warriors. Keep in mind those are just umbrella terms to simplify really complex concepts that undergird it all. But to give a high-level view of what some of the key components of this authoritarian playbook are, I want to walk through each one of these first. And it's not to say it's replacing previous versions. The authoritarian regimes still continue to do many of the same aspects that they've been doing for years and years, as far as they're leveraging rules and laws to squash dissent and so forth. But these are some new tactics that have emerged over the last decade. And so to make sure that we're all on the same page as far as what I even mean by warriors, trolls, and bots, spend a brief minute talking about the actual definitions of those. And so for warriors, in this case, I'm referencing cyber warriors, which is probably one of those terms that's most hated, I think, within our community, and rightly so. But it does get at what we're talking about as far as experts in computer network operations. And so in this case, we're talking more so about offense. Certainly can be on the defensive side, but for this, for the case here, that we're talking about more so on the offensive operations. And so while warriors try and get at compromising computers, trolls try and compromise hearts and minds. And so those are the entities who leverage any of the online forums to influence opinions, shape narratives, and basically to interject differing opinions for a certain kind of outcome. Now, both warriors and trolls are leveraging bots. And so again, bots is a larger umbrella term that I use to talk about the machine learning and automation. Some may even throw in AI, but I don't think we're quite there yet. But really more so the automation and machine learning that the warriors and the trolls leverage to achieve both really widespread impact as well as really tactical impact. And so these are kind of the cast of characters that are being used. And importantly, especially what we see a lot in the media, sometimes the trolls and the bots get confused for one another. And so generally the trolls actually have human beings behind them, whereas the bots are those automated tasks. And so if we're looking at each one of these now, to break them down even further, when we're talking about the warriors out there, the various kinds of cyber attacks and the tools that are going on, really the way I look at it, one of the biggest themes that I see is proliferation. And that's proliferation of targets. Really, no targets are seemingly off limits now. We're seeing universities are attacked, elections, as we certainly have seen, critical infrastructure, banking, pretty much you name it. Anything is within realm of the possible for a target. As far as the tactics and tools, these also are proliferating. You think about, thanks to the shadow brokers and Vault 7 dumps, we have a whole new set of tools that are out there and available. And this gets at sort of the asymmetric nature of the cyber domain, where it takes fewer and fewer resources to have a bigger and both a more global and a very tactical impact that wasn't previously accessible. And that's how we're starting to see the rise in actors occur. And so actors now don't have to have the resources, and so it's not just the nation states. I think traditionally we tend to think about China, Russia, North Korea, Iran as the big four here, US, UK, Israel, all having very sophisticated capabilities. But a lot of the other nation states actually are starting to take similar approaches, leveraging both the tactics and tools that have been used by the more sophisticated nation states that have been doing it longer. Vietnam has an APT now. A group linked to Lebanon had a global Android malware campaign. And it's not just states, for sure, I think as we all know here. Criminal groups certainly are leveraging a lot of these tools and tactics. So are terrorist organizations in certain areas. Syrian Electronic Army a while back hit at the New York Times. But also we see some of the lone wolves, and then we also see some of the hacktivists. And then even in certain places we're seeing the rise of corporations, especially corporations that, whose basic industry is in giving some of these offensive tools to governments. And there are actually some news on that today within the UAE. And so it's proliferation across the board in each of these areas. And a similar story can be said for the trolls. But again, this is more so on the information side and compromising the hearts and minds. And so while we tend to think of this as more the political objectives that are out there, we tend to, especially in the United States, we hear this more so in the realm of influencing elections and so forth. We have to keep in mind that it's not just in the political realm, and that it's going to be spreading into the business and corporate. If you can imagine influencing branding, can impact the financial area, and then obviously you have the ideological area as far as what kind of ideology they're trying to help promote and influence. As far as the tactics for the trolls, these tend to follow a wide range, and again, it's important to note that because there's a diverse range of these different actors, mix and match which ones best help them meet their objectives. And so astroturfing is basically making it seem like there's a grassroots movement when it's really something that's coming from the government down. We see China using this tactic a lot. Fake or stolen accounts, definitely something that is a favorite of a troll to then push forth some fake information. Disinformation, and again, this is one that's, we see disinformation and misinformation misused a lot as well when we're talking about this, and the core difference is intent. So within disinformation, there's an intentional misleading of the information that is being spread. Think about propaganda. That's been around, I think as long as there have been political entities. But the difference that we're seeing now is that with its computational propaganda, it's just that the speed of it and the reach of it is just that much faster, which makes it that much more influential. And finally, the sock puppets are basically some of the software that enable the trolls to create some of these fake personas online and create them at scale. And so this notion of at scale is where a lot of the automation and the machine learning come into play with the bots. And so if you think about some of the global ransomwares that hit back in 2017, WannaCry, NotPetya, Bad Rabbit, a lot of those benefited from the automation and were self-propagating to have a much greater impact. And then when we think about some of the targeting that may perhaps go on social media, a lot of that benefits from the automation and even some of the machine learning to help identify which targets might be the most susceptible for certain kinds of influence campaigns, for example. And so we're seeing a lot of different groups leveraging both of those, leveraging the bots for both having that global influence, such as the ransomware attacks, but then also really figuring out who to hone in on for some influence campaigns via social media. Now, what we're seeing is that these three, the bots, trolls, and warriors, are actually increasingly being used in conjunction as well, which is, again, an interesting trend that even just a few years ago, they pretty much were stovepiped into their own areas. And the Worldwide Threat Assessment yesterday, if anyone's following that, highlighted the use of both the cyber attacks and the influence campaigns, so it being used together. And so I just want to walk through what this might actually look like in a scenario. So let's imagine that we've got some bots that are amplifying an anti-country propaganda and have fake accounts and disinformation that is being spread. And this happens in an area where there already are societal tensions. And that's the core for a lot of these, is that what the bots, trolls, and warriors are doing is they're taking advantage of tensions that are already there, either beneath the surface or are quite prominent. So let's say this is what's already going on. We're starting to see some social media campaigns trying to aim at some of that unrest that already exists in an area. All of a sudden, a state-run media is hacked. And within that, the trolls then come in, take the website that's been hacked, and they start to put some, basically cyber vandalism, and they're putting on different information on there that's highly controversial about a regional foe. What happens then, obviously, it helps ignite even additional regional tensions. We start seeing a battle of the hashtags going back and forth between the two groups. And then finally, the regional hegemon, the main power within that region, steps in, takes a stance, and basically says, okay, we're gonna have an economic and political boycott of that original country that had the state-run media get hacked. And so that's not necessarily a futuristic scenario. It's what happened back in 2017 when we think about what happened with Qatar and the boycott that still exists today on the political and economic area. And it didn't stay regional. And again, this is one of the key things to think about when talking about the digital authoritarianism. What happens in these areas, it is spreading. And so, and even if it's not the exact attack that spreads, the impact of it does spread across the political, socioeconomic systems. And so with the example for Qatar, it brought in the major powers across the globe. Some of these countries have reinstated relations. Some of them were in there to actually help out and try and serve as mediators. But at the end of the day, the Qatar boycott that still is going on, initially links back to a hack on the state-run media, which exacerbated those tensions that were already there. And so this authoritarian playbook is something that we're just at the national and the governmental level in the United States are just starting to come to terms with. And this is a good quote by Mark Warner back in December that basically says that we have failed to recognize and understand what this authoritarian playbook actually looks like. And so, because basically everything that I talked about with the bots, trolls, and warriors, a lot of it isn't something that just came out of nowhere. It's been going on for years, if not decades in some cases. And we're just now starting to catch on to this model and what the impact it can possibly have. And because of that, because we haven't actually done a ton in this area to counter the authoritarian playbook, we're at a crossroads right now. And so there are two different models. And so there's that one model of digital authoritarianism that I talked about already. And then there's also this multi-stakeholder model. And this is the one that focuses much more so on a free and open internet. It's what's been pushed forth at the UN for quite some time until some of the negotiations fell apart a little over a year ago. And so those are the two competing visions that we're seeing right now. And when I started talking about how we're at this inflection point, this is the inflection point that we're at, where one model is spreading much faster than the other one right now. And to highlight this and to highlight sort of the how the democracies currently are kind of muddling through and trying to figure out how to make sense of democracy in a digital age. We do have the Gdpr, which has been discussed here. And love it or hate it, at the end of the day, it's the first major movement by democracies to help safeguard individual data, privacy, and security. And so the European Union right now is taking the lead on pushing back on this digital authoritarian model. And just as the digital authoritarian model is spreading, the GDPR now is serving as a model for other states, absent any other democratic alternative. And so we're seeing Brazil, India, Japan, and many others starting to think about different aspects of the GDPR to then have them within their own federal legislation. And then what about us in the United States? We're currently at a place where it's much more of a patchwork system. So our data privacy and data security regulations are industry-specific. We've been talking, HIPAA has popped up throughout this conference, and the financial industry has its own regulations. Each state then has some of their own regulations as well. California's Consumer Protection Act, the one that just came out, is leading the way and providing a US alternative. And just as the GDPR is having a model for other countries to follow suit, the CCPA is a model that other states in the United States are starting to take different components of it and pass those as well. Vermont has a Data Brokers Act. And then if you think about even for data breach notification in the United States, we have over 50 different data breach notification laws going on right now. So we're kind of muddling through trying to figure out how best to counter this digital authoritarian model while preserving democratic values of individualism and privacy. And so the muddling along kind of looks like a road that's kind of has ups and downs going around. That UN group of governmental experts, and basically all those on the left are kind of the more traditional ways that governments have come together to negotiate various kinds of norms, which are rules of the road, to try and come to some sort of agreement for establishing what what is appropriate behavior and what is not appropriate behavior, what can be protected, what is fair game. And so all those on the left are what has currently been done for the better part of the last decade. But we're starting to see, though, because almost all of those have started to fall apart or have competing models that really just can't come to terms with one another, such as like the NATO and the Shanghai Cooperation Councils have different perspectives on what is appropriate behavior, the private sector is starting to get involved. So the Tech Accord that's up there, that's one that's been led by Microsoft. I think it has over 60 different members of it now, and it basically sets the rules of the road for both offense and defense for the members that are part of it. The Charter of Trust is a Siemens-led group. I think it has close to a dozen members now, and it looks more at providing the low level of security, sort of that low-hanging fruit that all members must adhere to when it comes to supply chain risk. And then what we're still seeing, which is even more interesting, that the Internet of Trust is a group. France's Emmanuel Macron, along with many other corporations and many other members across the globe, signed the Paris Agreement back in November. And that was, again, starting to highlight some of the norms of what the proper rules of the road are, generally for democracies. And in that case, the US did not sign it, but US corporations were there. And so corporations are interestingly starting to take some of the leadership, absent some US leadership in this area. And then even more interesting, some of the cross-border trade agreements are starting to have within them some regulations as far as what to do about data localization and data storage, whether governments can access that or not, or whether that can be free and open flowing data. And that's what we see in the bottom right. And so as we see this, and as we're kind of navigating along, trying to come to the democratic model, there are signs of hope. And so really a lot of these that I'll talk about now to conclude happened over the last year. One thing in the United States is that public opinion is shifting dramatically, both across Republicans and Democrats, which is a rare thing to say right now. And so a 15-point spread difference over 3 months at the beginning of last year in favor of some sort of regulation. In this case, it's for regulating tech and how tech controls data. At the same time, again, about a year ago, most in the tech community, private sector, were very much opposed to any kind of US federal regulation to protect data privacy and to protect and for security. And just within the course of 1 year, IBM CEO Ginni Rometty switched from basically being in favor of self-regulation to saying, okay, you know what? After everything that happened last year, perhaps some form of some regulation might be necessary. And then putting it even more bold, Apple CEO Tim Cook said, we're in full support of a data privacy law within the United States. And so these advocates for this law were the ones that traditionally had been very much opposed to it and had hindered it. And so we'll see what happens with that, but this is an interesting movement that we're starting to see and some progress that could be made towards greater security and privacy. And then even at the government level, again, for so long, we've really failed to have some overarching cybersecurity legislation, some overarching data privacy legislation, but the legislators are starting to get involved in now. Senator Ben Sasse, Republican, says now it's finally time for us to draft our playbook. And then just last week, the Cyber Diplomacy Act, it was introduced last year, got reintroduced this year. And what I found especially interesting about this time was that, again, it's bipartisan, which is great. And those advocating for it stress on this, both the authoritarian attempts by China and Russia and others, and that model out there, and that the Cyber Diplomacy Act can help push forth, led under the US State Department, more of a democratic alternative that focuses on internet freedoms. And so we're starting to see a lot of this language now making its way into some of these proposals, which is a positive sign if we want to help push back on the digital authoritarianism that is spreading. Yes. And so, of course, as we all know, not to be a downer, that has not passed yet. But for all of us, what we can do, one, we can help be more aware of those kind of policies that are out there and help promote them. But there are other things that we can do to help ensure that the democratic model that comes forth does help safeguard individual security and privacy. And one of the key things, and this is what I think we're sometimes really horrible about, is we have to make sure we're not fighting the last war. So often we're hearing analogies about, okay, we're entering a Cold War 2.0. That's what the new world system's like, and so we just need to have Cold War theories and protections. And we're not in that kind of system at all. So anytime you hear that, please cringe a little bit and just say, no, we're in a very different international system. The polarities are different. The technology is different. We need to look forward and innovate. And so for those innovations, I'd argue they should come across 3 different areas at a very high level for the democratic playbook. one in the area of privacy and the privacy legislation, one in the area of norms. And so both of those tend to be more on the policy front, which are really important. And the third's unusable security, and that's more on the tech side. And so what I mean by each of those, so in privacy in the United States, a federal data privacy regulation. We're going to hear about this a lot this year, I imagine. If I were to predict, I doubt that'll pass this year, but we're going to start hearing more and more about that. And it's, I think, it's on all of us to help ensure that it has that proper balance to still ensure innovation and economic growth, while at the same time safeguarding individual security and privacy. On the norms side, this is where it gets into both the proper behavior in cyberspace, and so that's both on the offense and defense side. When is it appropriate? What might be some of the repercussions for some of the attacks? But then also what's off limits. And so we're starting to see, especially with that Cyber Diplomacy Act, the norms are starting to escalate a bit more. And these things matter a lot. I was in Chile a little while ago, and they were talking about some of the indictments that the US had done, which then helped them frame their own response to a big attack, cyber attack that had happened on one of their national banks. And so again, what happens in the United States and in the democracies spreads to other like-minded countries. And then finally, usable security. And this is where I think a lot of folks in this room can also come into play. Just making sure security is that much more accessible so individuals can also take it in their own hands. They don't have to wait for these policies and these norms to shift, that we're become more empowered to know how to use it. We move beyond sort of the, everything to blaming everything on the user to making technology actually work better for the user. And why all this matters, just a reminder to come full circle. All these things matter significantly for our privacy and as we move forward. Across the last few days, we've had some good calls to action as far as what kind of future internet do we want? And this is exactly where all these three different areas are going to help shape the future of the internet across the globe. And it matters for privacy, it matters for conflict and stability. We've seen that in many cases just over the last year. Significant for our national security, economic security, data protection, and for democracy. And so, I think it's upon all of us. There's a lot that we can do in these areas. While the digital authoritarianism still continues to spread, there is a counter movement underway, and it's just starting over the last year, and we need to help push forward that wave and ensure that a democratic version of internet freedoms and security and privacy is what helps counter that movement and spread globally. And so with that, I will take any questions. Thanks for your time.